Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Rosenstein, I want to clear up a few issues here. First of all, once again, we've heard here from some in the committee that Inspector Horowitz's report, which you've read and discussed with us today, found that there was no evidence of bias in the activities of the FBI and in the Crossfire hurricane investigation. I think that's clearly not what he found. But first, let me establish this. In the report itself, the Inspector General found that the Crossfire hurricane team's receipt of the Steele election reporting on in September 2016 played a central and essential role in the FBI's and the department's decision to seek the FISA order. Do you agree with that?
I'm aware of what was in the FISA application, and I understand that people who were more directly involved, like Mr. McCabe, have testified about that. So I didn't know everything that they knew, but that's my understanding.
All right, thank you. Now, with regard to this question of whether there is bias, this is one of the main reasons we're here in this hearing today as to what happened and why the problems that arose came up. The Inspector General, as we all know, found 17 significant violations of process and procedure that resulted in you stating here earlier today that had you known them, you would not have signed the FISA request.
Correct.
In that context, he did indicate, as I read it, that he found bias, but that he could not prove that the bias was a cause of the decisions that were made. Do you agree with that?
Yes, Senator. I think that's the way I would characterize it, that it's not that he didn't find bias, it's that he didn't find evidence that the bias affected the outcome.
In fact, the phrase that he used, and which is now very common, is that he could not find documentary or testimonial evidence that the bias caused the decisions made by the team, correct?
I don't recall the exact words, but I accept that.
I asked the inspector about that when he was here testifying before us about his report, and he basically confirmed that, and I concluded it with him saying, so how did you try to find out if it bled into the decision-making, if the bias did? And he said, I asked those who had the bias, and I asked those who were making the decisions, and they said no, they didn't let bias cause their decision-making. And because I could not find documentary or testimonial evidence otherwise, I concluded I couldn't prove that there was bias in the final decision-making. That's how I read it. At that point, I said to him that I found it inexplicable. Actually, I think he used that word. I found it mind-numbing, I think is what I said to him, that you could not see the bias bleeding into the decision-making. And he responded to me by saying, I said, how could you not reach that conclusion? Basically, he said, there is such a range of conduct here that it is inexplicable. And the answers we got were not satisfactory, that we are left trying to understand how could all these errors have occurred over a 9-month period of time, or so among 3 teams, handpicked one of the highest profile, if not the highest profile case in the FBI, going to the very top of the organization involving a presidential campaign. So he said, I think he was saying he thought it was inexplicable. I said to him, I understand that. I think it is explicable. I think it was bias. My question to you is, what do you think?
I think it's a very important issue, Senator. I think the important thing to keep in mind, and again, I have the experience of 3 decades in law enforcement, our goal is for the Department of Justice to be nonpartisan in its operations. Our people are not nonpartisan, though. We have people with very strong political views on both sides. I have my own political views. Obviously, the Attorney Generals always have political views, and our line employees do too. The goal is to train them about the way they go about their work, to exclude political partisan considerations from their decision-making. So what was concerning about the information the Inspector General turned up was that it wasn't that our employees had political views, it was that their political views appeared to be influencing their conduct of the investigation, at least based on what their messages suggested. Now, the Inspector General completed his investigation, and he reached his conclusion. But my goal, Senators, number one, is to avoid actual political influence. Number two is to avoid the appearance of political influence, which is very difficult. So I encourage you to keep in mind we don't require our employees to have no views. We just encourage them to set their views aside when they're doing their work.
I understand that, and I understand the difference between the appearance of political influence and the reality of it. And my question goes to the fact that when you've got, as the Inspector General said, when you have all of these errors, 17 significant errors, one including a criminal act of changing a document, occurring over a 9-month period of time among 3 teams handpicked on one of the most high-profile cases in the country, isn't there a point at which you must say that there's a real possibility that this appearance is real?
Well, it's an appearance that the work was not done properly, whether it was a result of bias or negligence or failed policies. I think that's something that General Barr needs to address, and I believe he will.
Well, you indicated that the outcome of the special counsel's investigation was that we found that Russians did commit crimes seeking to influence our election, and that Americans did not conspire
Correct.
with them. That's correct.
Yes, sir.
And then I'll just conclude with this. I'm going right back to your introductory comments, and that is, as you concluded your testimony, you indicated that the Inspector General concluded that so many basic and fundamental errors were made by 3 separate hand-picked teams on one of the FBI's most sensitive investigations that FBI officials expected would be subjected to close scrutiny, raised significant questions regarding the FBI chain of command, management, and supervision of the FISA process. You still stand by that?
Yes, sir. I always emphasize to my subordinates that it's very important for us to follow the rules, because if we don't follow the rules, people are going to question our motivations. And so it's certainly understandable that you would be concerned about that. And my hope is that the Attorney General will be able to put in place new policies, and if people committed misconduct or crimes, that they'll be held accountable for them.
I think there was way more than just significant questions about the FBI's chain of command management. I think there's significant questions about whether bias bled into this investigation.
Thank you very much, Senator Crapo.